Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started in just a minute here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the 2021 Massachusetts Open Space Conference. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend today's session and for your dedication to protecting and enhancing your community's open spaces. Right now, we have over 75 people here, and we had over 280 registrants for this session from all over the state. Before we start, I'm going to share a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. First, I want to say thank you to the Department of Conservation and Recreation Working Forests Initiative for sponsoring this conference. Next slide. Today's conference is being recorded, and the link will be posted on our website as well as shared in a follow-up email. Any resources referenced by the speakers will be available on our website as well. And new to the conference this year, we have case studies. Open space committees from across the state have shared their knowledge and expertise, and we highly encourage you all to check these out on the website resources page. Next slide. Today's seminar topic is Trails and Recreation. Our first speaker is Tom Chamberland. Tom serves as the chair of the Massachusetts Recreational Trails Advisory Board, which is the agency in charge of Mass Trails grant programs. He's also a member of the Sturbridge Trails Committee. Tom will begin by sharing some of the town of Sturbridge's progress on developing and maintaining trails, and then he will go into talking about the Mass Trails grant program. Then we'll move more to implementation. Our second speaker, Malcolm MacGregor, will share information about the 300 plus miles of trails in the town of Plymouth, as well as how to map and publicize trails once they're developed. And I will introduce Malcolm further before his talk. Next slide, please. After both of our speakers have shared, we will have a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions throughout the talks. We will go through as many questions as possible after both of our speakers have finished presenting. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Tom. So you can go ahead and share your screen.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Chamberlain, chair of the Massachusetts Recreational Trails Advisory Board and a member of the Sturbridge Trails Committee. And I'll be briefly speaking about our experience with open space and trails in Sturbridge, and then get into a few slides on the Mass Trails Grant Program. So Sturbridge has long been at the crossroads of transportation routes. That's kind of what got us started as a community. And over the years, through the development, most notably Old Sturbridge Village, the town has become to have a lot of related commercial tourist development, from hotels to restaurants, to now the outdoor acreage that we're working on protecting and preserving and using as an economic engine for the town. Our first acquisition of open space lands was from actually Old Sturbridge Village. It was an 880 acre parcel that we acquired in partnership with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And it was our first parcel that we acquired under the Community Preservation Act. And I would say for us as a community, it definitely was a learning curve. Once the property was acquired, one of the first things the town did, even though it was under care, custody, and control of the Conservation Commission, the town felt it was appropriate to form a Public Lands Advisory Committee to assist the Conservation Committee in using the public lands. So as soon as once we bought it, other community organizations said, well, can we build ball fields? Can we do this? Can we do that? And so that's where the learning came in, is exactly the extent of the conservation restrictions at that time. And then also with Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, they felt it was appropriate to remove 3 small pond impoundments and dams, restoring native brook trout habitat through the property. All of this combined created an awful lot of debate in the town, and on the dam specifically, because the residents saw a very scenic aesthetic view of that, more than maybe appreciating the environmental perspectives of acquiring open space. The picture that you see on this slide happens to be the floor of one of the ponds that was removed. The dams were removed, and Mass Fish and Wildlife went in there with a contractor and restored the streams. And this is some of the vegetation that's coming back into that area. So even though you don't see a pond, it looks still rather pastoral with the fields and open space. So following all of that, a number of members of the Public Lands Advisory Committee just decided this is not for me, and the town had to take a step back. But subsequently, and kind of at the same time, we did have a regional trail committee that was focused on a trail we call the Grand Trunk Trail. It had 3 members. And because trails were one of the things allowed, that Trails Committee decided to take on the building open space trails. And so the town approved it in 2006. It was expanded to 10 members. We have 5 full members and 5 associate members. They're responsible for all town property trails and supporting our trail partners, those being the other people in our community that own open space and have trails on their property. Just some numbers of the success of that. I'm sorry. We've accumulated since 2009 over $350,000 in volunteer time and donations. We've been awarded just over $1 million in grants. And in 2020 alone, pandemic aside, we recorded 41,000 in volunteer time and donations to our trails program. The bulk of that being our volunteer trail days, which are held on the 3rd Saturday of every month from April through November. One of the first things the Trails Committee decided that the town needed to do to definitely provide some guidance and long-term direction was to create a trails master plan. This was a plan that was fundable by the Community Preservation Act. We did it in 2010. It was finally adopted in 2012. And I say finally because we hired 3 professional trail building certified companies to put it together. And obviously, like any master plan, it's done with public meetings and public input. They went out and walked a lot of our properties and tried to generate conceptual trail plans and designs. And obviously the mission was twofold. They came up with that we adopted was connecting all of our neighborhoods to trails and open space, and that the trails themselves would become a second leg for tourism with a goal of getting up to 50 miles of high quality trails. And that's trails for anybody, hiking, horseback riding, mountain biking, you know, just getting out in the outdoors. So it's a multiple phase effect. We do have 5 trail standards. In other words, there's 5 different levels of design trails. And we identified 5 trail partners at that time. They held other open space, and that brought land open for open space to 4,000 acres for trails. Also in our master plan, we have sections on bicycle-friendly streets and our main river flowing through the town, the Quinnebog River, creating a water trail. And as we go forward, all of our new CRs reference this plan as part of what's approved as for trails on the property. The other thing we did is once we started pulling all this information together, felt that just having a half dozen or 8 or 10 different brochures was maybe not so much cost effective, but we thought we would put all of that into information instead into one larger trail guide where people could access it, download it, copy, print out the maps they want or the information. It's currently in its second printing. It is funded by, the town has a hotel motel tax. So it's basically funded by tourism. Here's the web link and you'll have the web link at the end too. And it contains maps of all of 10 properties that we have with trails, 5 are town, 5 of our partners. And right now we're up to 33 miles of good quality trails. So we're not quite to our 50 miles yet, but we're working on it. It does have a page on general trail rules and explains our trail types per the master plan. So again, people can read it and understand what kind of trail experience they're going to have if they pick up a trail, that type of information. It also contains QR codes to every one of our partners and the town pages that have the maps. Obviously, I think we all know as soon as you print something, the next day it's out of date. So we felt by doing QR codes, as new trails are added and organizations update their trail websites, which are probably going to be done much more frequently than us going out and printing a new trail guide that gives them the latest information. And of course, it includes lots of good pictures of our trails. Another item that has been developed in 2013 was, and again, this is following our goals of our master plan, was to create a nonprofit group to support the Trails Towns program. And so our nonprofit is called the Friends of Sturbridge Trails, or FROST for short. And they help and organize, they're all volunteers and they assist with our trail days. They actually host a website for trails outside of the town's page website, official website. They host our Facebook page, excuse me, which currently has over 1,600 likes. And they try, of course, last year with COVID, this pretty well got knocked out of the off the realm, but they generally host about 6 focused trail-friendly walks throughout the year, including night hikes and focused hikes for small kids to high-tech mountain bike rides. And they also, on an annual basis, recognize our trail volunteers in the town. Here are some links, and of course, this will be available, I think, as a reference already. But it's our town's trails webpage, so our official town committee, our trail master plan, if you want to take a look at that, our open space plan. And if you want to look at how we are slowly developing tourist page information for visitors to Sturbridge and what we offer. I'd like to switch now quickly to go on to trail funding and our Mass Trails grants. There are several grants available. They kind from the state or federal government, and they kind of fall into 4 pots. And here are the 3 that are state and federal. First is the Federal Transportation Enhancement Act. Then in 2018, the governor started a shared use regional trail Mass Trails grant funding program. And the part of the T funds breaks out money for recreational trails program that probably most of you have heard about, the RTP program. It's actually transportation funds that are passed through Mass Highway, MassDOT, to DCR for the Mass Trails Grant Program. So the federal funds, the federal act is usually reauthorized every 5 years. You can apply through your local regional planning agency and Mass DOT. The funds are provided for under what's called the Federal Alternative Transportation Program, which covers rail trail and shared use paths. This is a time-consuming process. Just to get on the T authorization, you need to apply, like I said, to your regional planning agency. They have to hold public hearings. They have to determine that it's an appropriate project to put on the STIP, which stands for the State Trails Improvement Plan. And that also has to be approved by Mass DOT. This is the big money pot. This one here, you can actually go for literally millions of dollars to build something. But it does require 20% match and a secure right of way. So it will not buy a rail line. It will not buy property. That needs to be done by others and have the property secured for perpetual public access. And like I said, it does require a 20% match. So even the match can get expensive for the very big project. There are obviously a lot of federal strings if you've ever done with the federal government, but it is a very good funding for really large projects, long distance and cost. Just to give you an example, town of Sturbridge did receive a Transportation Enhancement Act grant back in 2005. And I am hopeful that come September of this year, we will be constructing the project. So 16 years it has taken us to get from the initial okay to being able to build the trail. And we're not there yet. Mass Trails Funds was something new started by Governor Baker in 2018. Basically what he recognized was that there was a gap between what we could fund with Mass Trails funding, which was capped at $50,000, and going for this large regional grant, that it kind of, there's a big gap in the middle there. So he decided to set aside state funds. It's a line item in the budget. The grant amount is limited to $300,000. So it still requires a 20% match. And it's an alternative to T funds where you don't need to do a huge project, but can definitely phase it into more manageable bites, so to speak. And trying to match 300,000 at 20% is maybe easier for a lot of communities than trying to match 3 million at 20%. And this last year, the legislature approved funding at 2.5 million. And then we come down to the Recreational Trails Program, RTP grants. Both this program and that last Mass Trails Program, they were all folded under one umbrella. So they're all now known as Mass Trail grants. The application is the same. And this are T funds that have been set aside for this purpose through that federal legislation. It will fund rail trail to single track, motorized, multiple use, diverse use. However, because it comes from the federal government, there are some required spending. 30% of the funds we get have to go to supporting motorized trails. 30% has to go to non-motorized, and then the remaining 40% can be a mix of either motorized or non-motorized or a blend thereof. This funds will fund engineering, permitting, land acquisition, construction, maintenance. It will not fund conceptual or very preliminary designs. And again, the grant amount is limited to 50,000. Occasionally we do fund projects up to 100,000, but that's by specific exemption, so to speak. There is a 20% match. And when you are building pedestrian trails, i.e. you say, I want to build a hiking trail, it needs to be accessibly compliant. We need to have a secure right-of-way. And this amount usually we get through the T funds is about $1 million. So a couple things to note on this is I talked briefly about accessibility. We ask applications to comply with the U.S. Forest Service accessibility guidelines, and there's a link to that at the end of my presentation. But basically, if you have a parking lot that is flat and level and hard surfaced or firm surfaced, you're required the first minimum 500 feet of the trail out needs to be accessible and going out forward. There is money under this program also for training and education grant funding. All grants that I've mentioned, every one of them are reimbursable only, meaning that you need to have the money in the bank, spend it, and then it will be reimbursed if you are awarded a grant. And there are 2 separate selection committees, MARTAB for the recreational trails funding, and the state working group appointed by the governor of employees in the various state agencies that review the Mass Trails grant. The grants are highly competitive. This year, we received 125 grant proposals, totaling some $12 million for the 3.5 million that was allocated. If you do decide to apply for a grant, please answer all the questions. Do not make assumptions that because maybe we work in trails every day, we would understand. But you need to provide all the required submissions. Note the funding limits, the 20% match, and in kind is okay. And please reach out to DCR or attend the State's Trails Conference. Hopefully there'll be one in 2022. We were going to try to do one this year, but with COVID, that just wasn't possible. And here's some links. Again, this information is all available to you on your Open State Base website for this conference. Fourth option is there are a lot of trail funds. I'm sorry for the phone interruption. I thought I silenced that. My mistake. There are other funds for recreational and motorized trails, generally in the 1,000, about 25,000. In Sturbridge, obviously you've heard me mention, we use Community Preservation Act funds, and we have adopted a hotel room tax, a local option, and locally we call that our betterment funds. There are other grants, American Hiking Society, if you're in a National Heritage Corridor, they sometimes have grant funding. IMBA, the International Mountain Bike Association. We've actually received grants from wineries and other outdoor gear manufacturers and other nonprofits who may have focus to, doing or fixing something on a scale. So specific funding for rail trail or single track, environmental or economic development, focus groups like that. Funding restrictions, always read the fine print of the grants, kind of look at what they're really looking to fund, and hopefully you can make your application match. And again, there's usually matches required. Like I said, they're upfront reimbursables and other restrictions. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be standing by after does his presentation, and I'll be glad to answer your questions then. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom. Remember, attendees, that you can send your questions in the Q&A, and the speakers will answer them after both speakers have given their talks. So our next speaker is Malcolm MacGregor. Malcolm is the chair of the Plymouth Planning Board, and he's a member of Wildlands Trust and the Plymouth Open Space Committee. Malcolm will be sharing some of Plymouth's trail projects with us today, as well as sharing some advice for those looking to map trails and make sure that they are available to the public. And I will turn it over to you, Malcolm. Let me get your slides up.
Oops, I forgot to share, sorry. Good afternoon. I'd like to give you an introduction today to some of Plymouth's trails, of which there are many, and what we do to maintain them, how we keep people and gain people and make them more and more interested all the time, and a little bit about how we built them. So we'll take a look at Plymouth's hiking trails. Next slide. I'm calling it Wandering the Plymouth Trails. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of one of the trails in Miles Standish State Forest, which is a large section of Plymouth, about 2,000 acres, with many, many trails, which we'll look at in a little more detail later. So we have trails in Miles Standish State Forest, Mass Audubon has some trails, the town of Plymouth has trails, and Wildlands Trust has trails. Next slide. A picture, a map of Miles Standish State Forest. And if you take a look at the map, you see that there's 2 and almost 3, if you're down on the right-hand side, of stream generation, ponds, and eventually streams going down into Buzzards Bay. All of these are explorable on our trails and give the trails a lot of interest. Picture on the right, we have the entrance to Miles Standish and one of the ponds in Miles Standish. Next slide, please. The town of Plymouth also has many trails. A couple of pictures, one of the ponds in Plymouth, which was also on the map, of which there are about 200 reasonably sized ponds in Plymouth. Next slide, please. Here is a picture of sort of a messy picture, if you will, of 100 trail loops that exist in Plymouth from 1.5 to 8 miles in length for a total of 280 miles. Some of them are one-way trails, most of them are loops, but we create one-way trails, which I'll show you a little bit later, by combinations of these. Not all of these are on public property or Wildlands Trust property or state property, but some private property where we gain permission to use them and build the trails. Next slide. Tidmarsh Farms is a Mass Audubon trail. It evolved from about the 1890s to early 1900s. A huge cranberry bog was built there, which is in the light green color. About 500 acres worth of cranberry bog. That was purchased by a family about 20 years ago who decided, rather than selling the upland, decided to recreate the river stream which runs through there, which is called Bartlett Brook and runs out into the ocean at White Horse Beach. So the cranberry bog was rebuilt over the course of 3 or 4 years, and with various grants by the folks that own Tidmarsh Farms. Next slide, please. It gives you a picture of the rebuilt cranberry bog, which has gone away by not all of it gone away now. The stream has been rebuilt through the bog at the the western end of the bog was a huge lake which was used for watering the bog. That is now created into a stream, and it's quite a spectacular area. There are many, many tourists that use it. There's a parking lot outside of it, which which holds about 100 cars. Next slide. One of Plymouth's recreations of an old cranberry bog called the Eel River Bog. This was done over a period with various grants from state, federal, and town. Over a period of 3 years, they planted in the process 1,700 white cedars, which you can't see in this picture, but they're all in the back and they're coming up dramatically. They're all in the order of 10 to 12 feet high now. And it's quite a beautiful area. There are trail loops around the outside of what you see here, trail loops further inland. So in this bog system and river system, we have at least 4 trails from 3 to 7 miles in length. Next slide, please. Wildlands Trust main office is in Plymouth. We have many trails in Plymouth and other communities in southeastern Massachusetts. Next slide. We have a picture of Wildlands Trust. The main office is on the right in the small photograph. The map on the left shows you the trust's location, which is into the left in the little circular loop across the street. Most of the land across the street is owned by the trust. There's a piece of town conservation land in there, and you can see the trails that exist through that area. The one in the upper left comes at one point from the state forest into this area. The one in the lower right will go to trails on the western side, on the eastern side rather, of Route 3, with many, many miles of trails ending up at various locations along Massachusetts Bay. Next slide, please. So we try to develop these trails with character that'll attract people because of their beauty, because of the topography, and just to have fun. Here is a trail around East Head Reservoir in the state forest, which starts at the main entrance to the state forest on Cranberry Road, which comes from Carver into, this is in Plymouth, into Plymouth, and the walking trail goes around the pond with various stops along the pond. It's quite a spectacular trail, and you can see in the upper right where you can divert from it and go to many more trails in the state forest. Next slide. One of Plymouth's trails, the Eel River Preserve, which I talked about a few moments ago. You can see the 2 trail loops which connect together. And if you start at the upper right and go along to the lower left and back, it's about 4 miles. You can go much further to the lower left into the state forest and make a longer trail, and a little bit further in the upper right and make a longer trail. The aerial image shows you Russell Mill Pond on the right, which is a dammed pond, and initially was used for the watering system of the cranberry bogs that were recreated where the Eel River Preserve was recreated. The dam is still there. It was rebuilt as a new dam further downstream, and it's used. You can hike pretty much all the way around it. It's conservation land. I don't have any of the trails in there right now, but it's quite spectacular pond. And it leads to a stream which goes out at Whitehorse Beach. Next slide. Plymouth has a couple of long hikes that we've developed. One is called the Wishbone Trail. We have a big Ramble 1 and a big Ramble 2, which I'll show you pictures of in a minute. And the Bay Circuit Connection, which connects from the Bay Circuit Trail to Cape Cod. Next slide. Here's the Wishbone Trail. The Wishbone Trail starts at the Miles Standish State Forest headquarters and goes pretty much east to Ellisville Harbor State Park on the lower right. It's about a 15-mile trail. It was created by a Boy Scout for his Eagle Scout project in 2007. It's fairly well mapped, and it's been remapped because we've changed the trail a little bit on the eastern side of Route 3. So he had it initially going along dirt roads. We've changed it into conservation land. We have quite a lot of conservation land on the eastern side of Route 3A there, so we moved it through the conservation land and remarked it. It's a trail that we usually do for a 2-day hike to Wildlands Trust, which is on the pond just to the west of Route 3, and then hike the remainder of it down to the beach at Ellisville on the next day. Next slide, please. Big Ramble is a north-south hike, a 2-day hike, 20 miles long. It starts in downtown Plymouth, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But I have it starting here just outside of downtown Plymouth, which if you travel down Route 3 at all, you'll notice where it starts, just beyond the parking lot of Home Depot. It goes south in between two ponds, Great South and Little South Pond, and then into the state forest, which you can see in green, following trails that exist in the state forest and have been joined together sometimes by dirt roads, sometimes by making short trail links. And it comes out in the southwestern side of the state forest in Wareham. And this particular trail ends at a place called Maple Springs, which is a large area of bogs in Wareham. There are trails in the going east at the bottom of that, which would take you over to the Cape Cod Canal. I don't have those on the map, but that's an even longer trail. This is about a 2-day hike as well, where you'd hike from either downtown Plymouth or from the start that I've pictured there into the headquarters of the state forest and then finish off the next day. And on the left, you see a picture of the hike, portion of the hike. Next slide, please. A Big Ramble 2 is a little bit different. It starts just north of Menomet at the top of the Pine Hills. And it goes towards, from the northeast to the southwest. And it goes well into Wareham. Passes a little bit through the state forest, passes by the Wildlands Trust headquarters, which is a good stopping point. And it's mostly on town of Plymouth conservation lands here and there, or Wildlands Trust conservation lands, until you get into the state forest, which occurs just at the pond that you see, which is fairly close to circular with a little island in the middle called Halfway Pond. Again, you see a picture on the left of a group of hikers at one of the locations along that hike. The views that you get are all sorts of views: woodland, open space fields, cranberry bogs, and ponds. Next slide, please. Sorry. The Bay Circuit Trail connection. The Bay Circuit Trail is a trail which starts in Newburyport and goes to Duxbury. We pick it up in Kingston, in the part of the Kingston State Forest, and it goes south, sort of through all of some of Kingston's conservation lands to Route 25, which goes from east to west, under a tunnel in that highway, and then through conservation land in Kingston, just south of 25, which belongs to a Vermont trust. South further on into Plymouth, and around, and where its furthest westerly point is in Carver, and then back into the state forest, and it ends at, in this case, at Great South Pond. But there are many routes from there to Cape Cod, two of which were the two big brambles that I showed. They intersect this trail and can be easily used. Next slide, please. We are still in the state of building a wheelchair access. The film that you see on the right sort of takes you through the links of that trail, and they're in red. It starts at Plymouth Rock and goes up beside what's called Town Brook, which you see there in the various ponds associated with Town Brook, into an area called Morton Park. And that will be all wheelchair accessible when it's completed. A lot of it is now wheelchair accessible. There has to be a sidewalk over part of it where we can't get any land, and that's still in the works. Morton Park is a fairly big park in Plymouth. We can use that also to join other trails that would meet at the end of that at Morton Park. Next slide, please. We do trail runs. We have runs and walks. Most of the time, there are monthly runs in conjunction with Mayflower Runners on Tuesday nights and Saturday mornings. And you can see the paces, 7 to 12 miles an hour, between 3 and 6 miles. Most of the running is on dirt roads rather than on trails, because the trails are more difficult. If you're interested in any of these runs, you would contact Wildlands Trust with the website provided. Next slide, please. I have posted a number of hikes, about 110 of them now, on Google Drive, and I've listed them in terms of their length from 1.4 to 2.7 miles up through 4 cycles from 5.1 to 7.3 miles for the loops. And that's an open site. Anybody can use it. We also have the long distance one-way trails that are on there, and a couple of short film clips to give you an idea of what they're like. And you might open them up and see what trails look like and the film clips look like on the left. Next slide, please. Developing trails. How do we develop trails? Well, we try to determine an area of interest, and we look for existing paths, of which there are a lot, and unfortunately now there are a lot that have been created by dirt bikes, which are obliterating large sections of Miles Standish State Forest. In some cases, we have to create joining trails, which are usually short. We have weekly trail cleaning events from Wildlands Trust and from the Town of Plymouth Open Space Committee. So we'd walk and clear the trails or create new trails. The Town of Plymouth is creating a lot of new trails on a lot of their land. now, and they maintain them quite well and publish them. They're in the process of finishing off a trail guide. The town of Plymouth is the Open Space Committee, which will be available soon, and it has quite a nice book. It has a lot of their trails in it. How do we map the trails? Well, we use a GPS unit or a cell phone with various types of mapping software. The best software I've found is called the GPX app, which is easy to use and easy to transmit to a computer and create a map out of it. So you email or download the result of your mapping software and create a map. Next slide. The pictures of a few of our trails. This is one of the big rambles starting at the top of the Pine Hills, which is sort of a three-dimensional type of view. The Pine Hills are an interesting place. It's the highest hill on the East Coast, south of Cadillac Mountain and north of South Carolina. It comes right up out of the East Coast. The water you don't see here, but on the aerial image is the black, without any change in pitch, any downward pitch. It's about 350 feet high, which is not very high, but it's still the highest point on the East Coast. And you can see the trail we have here. It runs along the ridge and then down to the right, which is the large blue area is the Tidmarsh Bog that I mentioned. There's another blue area just to the left at the bottom of the hill, which is called the Foothills Preserve, which they're building now, which is, again, is an old bog that's been repurposed as a trail wetland area. Quite beautiful and not quite open yet, but it will be soon. And the trail going down the western side is not quite so steep, but there are some spectacular views along that to the northwest. And that's one of the big rambles that goes on to the southeast. In a more planar fashion, you can see the map on the right, where that same two trails are there, but they continue on further inland. Next slide, please. After we've scoped out these trails, we begin to create a map document. On the left, you see a map document created by the town of Plymouth for one of their trail systems at a place called Beaver Dam Pond, and there's a picture of that on the right, an aerial photograph, and an arrow pointing to the actual land that trail is in. Next slide, please. One of Wildland's trust properties has they own parcels of land on the east and the west of Halfway Pond, and actually between Wildland's Trust and Makepeace Cranberry Company and DCR, they own all around that pond. So that's one or two houses on it, and that's all. There is quite a well-used loop called Gramps Loop, which is in red on that map. And a picture of the forest of that is on the right. And I'll take you for a walk through that in the next slide. Next slide, please. With an ocean view. Likes the music I put on there, which, if anybody's interested, is Ahmad Jamal at the Persian. Next slide, please. So the hiking adventures we have during the years are Thursday morning hikes usually, and now we've also added a Monday morning hike from 3 to 5 miles. Sunday dog hikes in the summers in the state forest, 2 to 4 miles. Wildlands Trust, we run the big rambles 2 Sundays in June, where we have a lunch a quarter of the way and 3/4 of the ways through. And most monthly Sundays, you have hikes with Malcolm, which are anywhere from 4 to 6 miles, and trail runs with Eric. And we also have many state forest meetup hiking groups, which are available almost any day of the week in the summer. Next slide. And that's one of the Miles Standish loops, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Malcolm.
You're welcome.
We're now going to open up the session to a question and answer session with both of our panelists. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function. Okay, so we're going to start with this question. It looks like it's for Tom. This is from Andrea, and she wants to know, does having a nonprofit help with receiving grants?
No. However, first of all, municipalities are generally considered nonprofits for most grants. There are some private funded grants, outside organizations that do require it be a nonprofit and not a municipality. But for the Mass Trails Grant, municipalities, nonprofits, even businesses can apply. The requirement, though, is that the property or the trails or the land be open to public use.
All right.
Added comment.
Yeah, of course.
If you haven't noticed, taxes go up every year. So it's the opposite of a profit-making operation.
Okay. Let's see. Alice wants to know, what does motorized trails include? Does it include snowmobiles and e-bicycles? Would all-terrain vehicles be included? And what about automobiles?
So yes, 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 and no. Briefly, motorized is recreational. It's recreational vehicles. I probably should have prefaced that in my presentation, that it's recreational motorized vehicles. So yes, snowmobiles, ATVs, dirt bikes, 4x4 Jeeps as a recreational vehicle. E-bikes is an interesting area. There's really no consensus across the trails community whether e-bikes should be allowed on non-motorized posted properties or not. And that debate is still continuing. I don't know that there will get an immediate resolution on that, but really it's up to the land managing agency as to where they want to place e-bikes as either motorized or or allowed in non-motorized use areas.
Okay. This question is for Malcolm. Do you have paid staff running all of the weekly walks and adventures, or are they volunteer led? And do you feel like these events bring in more trail work volunteers?
There's one paid person who leads some of the hikes and the trail runs. That's Eric. He's paid by Wildlands Trust. All of the other weekly trail walks are by volunteers, and we have about half a dozen different volunteers. What was the second part of the question, Anna?
Do you feel like these events bring in more trail work volunteers?
Oh, yeah. Oh, getting more and more all the time, which is good.
All right, thanks for that question, Em. Let's see. Tom wants to know, this question looks like it's also for Tom. Do any of the trails in Sturbridge cross private land using historic rights of way?
The short answer is yes, but for every one of those crossings, we have acquired a easement that permanently allows the trail to cross private land. So yes, we do, but every one of them is secured with an easement that allows public access.
Okay. Let's see. Karen wants to know, it looks like this question's for Malcolm. How was that last interactive map created?
The one where I have the icon walking around and music.
I believe so.
Yeah. That was done. I did that about 4 years ago, and I can't remember the name of the computer program, but it's a spin-off of ArcGIS, which creates those kind of movies. And if you can give me your address, I'll send you the name of the program.
Okay, yeah, I can. I'll make a note of who asked the question, and Malcolm, if you send that to me, I can pass it along. Yep. Okay. Let's see. Joe Greeley wants to know, this looks like it's for Malcolm as well. Is camping allowed at the Wildlands Trust headquarters for the long hikes, such as the Bay Circuit Trail Connector?
No. State Forest, yes, but not Wildlands Trust. Wildlands Trust doesn't have any facilities for camping.
Okay. All right. It looks like this question is for Tom. This is from Amy Green. She wants to know, can you speak to building code requirements for a footbridge or boardwalk on an existing trail? Does the entire trail need to be made ADA compliant or just the new boardwalk?
That's a good question. Getting into the ADA requirements is a 40-minute presentation I normally do at the Mass Trails Conference. But briefly, boardwalks are not the same as bridges because of the way they are supported. So we work locally with our building inspector, and this is what I advise every community to do, is reach out to your building inspector with a plan. Ours has been very cooperative to work with. When it comes to bridges, we try to make our bridges a minimum of 36 inches wide. That does address ADA compliance. And as far as rails or curbing, the decision factor there is based in the building code, where it's a drop of more than 2.5 feet. We do put rails on. If it's a drop of less than 2.5 feet, we just put a curb, which is basically a block of wood that extends the length of the bridge that is at least 3.5 to 4 inches high. That's what complies with the ADA requirement. So it looks like a curbing on the side of a road, like a sidewalk curb, that type of structure. So it detects the edge of the bridge so no one falls off. But again, the drop is usually the guiding factor. If it's over 2.5 feet, our building inspector requests that we put in some type of railing.
Okay. This question is for Malcolm. This is from Tom. Do any of the trails in Plymouth follow the shoreline across private land using Chapter 91 access?
No.
Okay. This one's also for Malcolm. This is from Dick. Malcolm, what is the level of participation on your planned hikes? And do you have a minimum number before you hold the hike?
No, the minimum number is just me. Usually, I would guess an average number might be about 6, and I don't want to have more than 12. It just gets too spread out.
I've been on a guided hike with Malcolm and they're great, just saying.
We, if we did have more than say 12, we'd have 2 leaders actually.
All right. Tom, Rick wants to know if you can say a bit more about the master plan process. How did you organize it? How long did it take? And did you work with many private landowners? And along with that, we have another question wondering which consultant you worked with.
Okay, so maybe a little preface to the answering that question. I retired in 2015 as a park ranger from the United States Army Corps of Engineers here in New England. I was assigned to some projects in the Central Mass area. But as I had an opportunity as the Corps continues to build into recreation and recreation development, that I took an interest in trails and trail construction and trail building. That allowed me to participate and attend a number of college courses on trail construction and accessibility, as well as attend 2 different organizations, their national trail conferences. There's an organization called the Professional Trail Builders Association. They are made up of people who make their living building trails professionally. And they have a certification process where they certify professional trail builders. The other organization, and I think I provided the link to it, is American Trails. They're probably one of the larger national nonprofit trail advocacy groups in the United States. They're actually international in scope. But if you do American Trails, they are a wealth of information. And I actually attended and presented at a number of their international conferences. So I had a background coming into Sturbridge, knowing how to, knowing a lot about good quality construction, sustainable trails, and knowing of the professional trail builders as an organization and their accreditation process. So sitting down with the Trails Committee and our Finance Committee and Community Preservation and, doing the local political advocacy, that's how we, in our specifications, we actually sought out professional trail builders to participate in creating our master plan. The company that was chosen was actually a consortium of 3 different professional trail builders. Kalin Enterprises, it's a husband and wife team, but their focus is on mountain bike trails and mountain biking. They were ambassadors for a while for IMBA. They actually traveled on IMBA's dime, across the United States, advocating and education on mountain bike trails. The other company was, let me just check my notes here real quick, Trail Dynamics. They were actually a company out of South Carolina that constructs trails and sustainable trails. And then the third company that came in was Trail, I can't read my notes, Trail Builders. Their focus was on the GIS and the mapping and using, GIS software and ArcGIS and everything and creating the maps and generating the maps. So the three of them together came into Sturbridge for several days. Looked around town, actually physically walked our number of our open space properties, reviewed all of the other town plans, our open space plan, our master plan, conservation documents, what's out there. They took about a year, 14 months to put it all together. Again, there was public input hearings. There was surveys done, so there was a lot of community outreach to see what the community wanted in the document. And at the end, they came up with a number of objectives and goals to reach our mission. They totaled some 80 in number. And as of today, we've kind of knocked off the list about 62 of them. They were kind of broken into three areas: the low-hanging fruit, or the easy ones to do first, some middle range things, and the ones we're working on now, which are the hardest, is the long range ones where we start adopting bicycle friendly streets and making some adjustments like that to curbs and sidewalks and what have you. So it's an ongoing process, and the town's now debating financially whether it's time to dust off that, we use it, but it's time to update it. Where are we at? How are we doing? Have someone else come in from the outside and kind of look over our shoulder and kind of give us the direction for the next 10 years.
Great, thanks. Elaine wants to know, it looks like either of you could answer this question. Is there a difference between hiking trails and walking paths for setting up paths?
I guess I would call what we have hiking trails. They're mainly single lane trails through the woods, unless they're a dirt road. Or a walking trail might be a sidewalk or a paved path, something like that.
So in our master plan, and I think I mentioned it in my presentation, we actually break out 5 different types of trails. One of them is a rail trail, very wide, very, generally fully ADA compliant, 10-foot wide, low grades, well-constructed trail. The next level down, service level, is called a truck trail, which is a 6 to 8 foot wide trail, more natural in layout and scope, but also accommodates multiple users, including horseback riding. So, when you start inviting different user groups onto your trails really need to be designed to accommodate that use without a lot of user conflicts or minimize user conflicts. We then have 3 levels of single track trail, which is down from, the 6 feet to the single track 1 is from around 36 to maybe 48 inches wide, more of a natural surface trail. But our bridge structures, our stream crossings are definitely, bridges and more formal. Single track 2 is closer to 24 to 36 inches wide, a little less developed, more definitely a natural surface trail, rocks, roots, that type of thing protruding. And then our single track 3 is kind of the real backcountry, Appalachian Trail type experience. And on all of our open space properties, we try to construct a blend of those trails so that it can serve the maximum number of residents and their needs, their preferences.
Great. We have an anonymous attendee asking Malcolm whether the trails in Plymouth are open to mountain biking.
Yes. Actually, any of the trails are open to mountain biking, but there are a large number of mountain bikers on the northeast side of that Pine Hills that I showed you. If you go down Route 3A or up Route 3A, depending whether you're going north or south, on the ocean side, there are many, many mountain bike trails and ramps and jumps and all this stuff that people do on a mountain bike. And most of the mountain bikers go there. There's a bike shop right at the top of the hill to service that. And occasionally we see a mountain biker on the other, some of the other trails, but not very often. But they can certainly use them.
Thanks. Okay. Joe wants to know, if an easement is acquired, can the funds come from Community Preservation Act funds, from the Friends Group? And are the easements granted to the town, to the committee, or to the Friends, or who are they granted to?
So the easements we've acquired are now being funded by community preservation funds. I think the first couple we acquired were before the Community Preservation Act was enacted. But now they're all funded by community preservation funds, and they are to the town. The town is the recipient of the easement.
Yeah, same in
Great. Okay. Danelle wants to know, what is a realistic minimum number of people needed to get a trail committee off the ground?
That's a great question. We have 10, as I mentioned, in Sturbridge. 5 are the full trail committee and 5 are associate members, which means they have no voting, but they can make at a posted meeting, they can make motions. They can actually second motions, but unfortunately they can't vote on them. It's just the 5 members of the committee. And for Sturbridge, we could use 5 more, really. We've got so many different projects going that it does take up time. But I would say my experience is most communities, at least out in the Sturbridge area, have a 5-member trail committee.
In Plymouth, we have the Open Space Committee, which is about 7 people that maintain a large number of trails. The town itself has about 3 employees, which maintain large numbers of trails. They have 15 trails they maintain. And trails we create and or make boardwalks for, or clean up, generally probably anywhere from 3 up to 7 people. But they change. The people change in that instance, where the townspeople are the same and the Open Space Committee are always the same. So it's a mix of all sorts of lengths of people, all sorts of numbers of people.
All right. Julia wants to know how you track and calculate the dollar value of volunteer time.
One of our volunteers is assigned that responsibility. Basically, they're done on very simple Excel spreadsheets. We track it more by property and trail, so that we can track how much it costs as we're actually constructing a trail, and then going forward what our maintenance costs are for that particular trail. Obviously, some trails, like the very basic single track trails, we're on them very infrequently unless we have a significant wind event. And then somebody's out there with a chainsaw, probably just checking to make sure there's no large trees down. Whereas when we get into our trek trails and our rail trail, That's a little higher level of service to maintain accessibility. And so our maintenance costs are a little higher there, for maybe monthly inspections, leaf blowing in the spring and the fall, that kind of stuff. The value we use is for volunteer time. There is actually a national volunteer rate. It's established by a consortium of different federal agencies and nonprofits, and both for the state trails grants and for our tracking, we use the national volunteer rate. I did not include that link, but I will send that to Anna and she can get it out. There is a national rate, and then they also determine rates for every state in the nation. And again, for the state, we accept that value in our trails grant if you want to put in, in-kind service. But it's also used by all of the federal agencies to track their volunteer time on their properties and, their reporting purposes. So I'll send that link to Anna and she can share it with everyone.
I'll post it on the conference resources page. All right. David wants to know, for trails on private lands, do you acquire easements or simple permission? And how do you ensure that that trail will persist if the land is sold?
Well, I can answer that partially. If it's on private land, we get permission. And I don't think we've ever had the occasion where it's been sold, except the one at the top of the hill potentially will be sold. So we have to deal with that issue in the future because that's a very popular trail. And we haven't got to that level of expertise yet as to how we're going to do that. It's mainly a bootstrap operation.
You'll interview everyone who wants to buy the land.
Yeah.
So in Sturbridge, we upfront acquire an easement from the property owner. And usually we've done both. We've described it by meets and bounds where it's an actually surveyed easement, or we have left it not generally described, but there's a clause in the easement agreement that says the property owner may have the right to relocate the trail, but always has to provide us some, space to have the trail through their property.
All right. Patricia wants to know, are motorized wheelchairs or mobility scooters allowed in non-motorized areas?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You cannot discriminate like that. There's one of the courses I took was on outside trail accessibility. And there are some wheelchairs out there specifically built for single track trail access. They may not be motorized, but that equipment is out there if people choose to want to recreate that way. So to deny their ability to recreate clearly would be a violation of the law. But even our CRs, the standard language in all of our CRs approved by the state specifically says you cannot discriminate and prohibit access, reasonable motorized access like that, wheelchairs, et cetera, on your properties, at least on the CRs.
And all town trails would be under that type of function, but the woods trails we've never run into it being an issue, so I haven't dealt with it because it's really very difficult for any motorized other than a dirt bike to get along a lot of them.
Along those same lines, here's a question for Malcolm. Have you found any effective methods for discouraging unauthorized mountain biking trail building?
No. No, it's It really did. Mountain biking's not so bad. It's the dirt bikes that are really difficult to control. And they dig trenches 6 feet deep in some cases after a few years of them.
Wow.
And it's really difficult because you can't catch them. If you complain about them, go try and get them. You can't find them. So,
Okay.
big problem.
David wants to know, do you require participants on your public hikes to sign releases from liability forms? One of their trails has some pretty rough terrain on parts of the route.
And we do if they're a wildlands trust hike. If I'm leading a hike, which I do usually 2 or 3 times a week, no, because I know everybody pretty well generally.
We do not for hike event participation, but we do give a safety talk before we take off on the hike, and kind of go over that particular hike details, the length, the topography, the challenges that may or may not exist, insects, ticks, there's I think we emphasize that you're in an outdoor environment and there is always a level of risk that cannot be always fully addressed when you're out in an outdoor environment. So we do have a kind of standard safety presentation that we go over before every hike event. We do, however, ask volunteers on our trail days to sign a waiver. We do provide all of the safety equipment, from gloves to safety glasses to hearing protection, hard hats, vests, etc. We provide the safety there. It's there for the people to use, but we also ask them to sign a waiver.
Great. Okay. An anonymous attendee is asking, does the town of Sturbridge co-hold easements with private entities? If so, how and in what documents are the responsibilities of each described?
Not sure I fully understand that question. My short answer is we have partnered with land trusts for easements. We did have a case where a particular private property owner did not want to give an easement to the town, but they were willing to work with a land trust, and they gave the easement for the trail to the land trust, and then the land trust turned around and signed an agreement with the town, so that at the end of the day, we still had that documentation that the access was there and protected. The only other agreements that I'm aware of that we have are really the holders of our conservation restrictions. We currently have 2 partners there. One is Mass Fish and Wildlife, and the other one is a local land trust, Opakam Land Trust. I'm not aware of any other easements that we hold for trails with anyone else outside of individual private property owners, and it goes directly to the town.
Okay. Let's see. Here's a question from Dick. He says to either speaker, do you have trail conflicts between various user groups, and how do you resolve them?
We haven't had any so far, but we have lots and lots of trails.
So no one's running into each other. They can spread.
Right. User groups, meaning horseback riders, mountain bikers, hikers, no. Our biggest controversy in Sturbridge user group is with those who walk their dogs off leash. That is definitely a user group conflict with those who either do not have dogs or choose to properly walk their dog on a leash. We're still working through that one.
Yeah, it hasn't been a problem for us so far.
Okay. Lynn wants to know, have any of your trail properties been impacted by forest management, Chapter 61? And if so, how?
Yeah, some of the some of the southern parts of the state forest have been they completely cut down all of the trees, so they changed from a forest to a field. The purpose is to remove white pines and get back to scrub pines, which is a fight against evolution, I guess. But they got some money to do that, and they're doing it. But
All right.
Yeah, we haven't had really, actually, we have not had any logging on any of our town open space properties yet. And as far as 61, that usually refers to private land ownership. And we haven't had that issue where we do have private trails on easement property. So it's been a non-issue for us.
Okay. All right. Well, we are going to close the Q&A here. A quick reminder that Tom will be available at the networking session tonight to answer questions about Mass Trails grants if anyone wants to ask more questions about how to apply for those. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Tom and Malcolm for presenting and sharing their experiences with trails and recreation in their towns. And before you go, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation form. The link has been shared in the chat, and we will review all of your feedback and use this to improve future sessions. This evening from 7 to 8, as I mentioned, we'll be having a networking session. While in some ways a webinar is a great format for a conference, we planned these networking sessions to fill in some of the social and collaborative gaps that are lacking in this remote format. And the goal of this session is to meet some other open space volunteers with whom you can connect and share resources around developing trails and other recreational opportunities in your towns. We hope to see you there. And next week is the topic for week 4 is community engagement. And we hope that you will join us for that as well. Thank you so much for coming today and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.